Good evening. I'm Matt Jordan, Associate Professor of Media Studies at Penn State University and the Executive Producer of Human Focus. We hope that you enjoyed watching Who Counts? The Complexities of Democracy in America. We think of these short documentaries as conversation starters about the topics we explore through the lens of the humanities. You can see our first two episodes on our webpage. In what follows, we will be seeing where that conversation goes with two different groups. One group of scholars, whose work helps elucidate our understanding of democracy, which I will now introduce, and one group of students. The first group will be comprised of faces and voices who will seem familiar from what you just watched. Clarence Lang is a professor of African American Studies and the Susan Welch Dean of the College of Liberal Arts here at Penn State University. He's the author of Grassroots at the Gateway, Class Politics and Black Freedom Struggle in St. Louis from 1936 to 75, and Black America in the Shadows of the 60s, Notes on the Civil Rights Movement, Neoliberalism, and Politics. He's currently working on a biography of Malcolm X that focuses on class politics and Black nationalism. Rachel Shelden is an associate professor of history and director of the George and Ann Richards Civil War Era Center. Her first book, Washington Brotherhood, Politics, Social Life, and the Coming of the Civil War, traced the foundations and aftermath of the Civil War in the American South. And she's currently working on a book on how the Supreme Court as we experience it today came to be. John Gastil is Distinguished Professor in Communication Arts and Sciences and Political Science at Penn State and is also the founding director and senior scholar at the McCourtney Institute for Democracy. He is the author of several books on democracy that deal with how we can best engage citizens in the process of deliberative democracy. His most recent is from this year, is called Hope for Democracy: How Citizens Can Bring Reason Back into Politics. So a lot has happened since we filmed in the spring. Have any of your thoughts about democracy changed since then?
It's more clear than ever that this is a make or break year for, I think, a lot of American institutions. And the act of voting itself is frankly under attack. And how this election goes and ultimately how the federal government in particular responds to that threat next year, I think could be crucial for some of our institutions.
Well, I agree with everything that John said and would add, perhaps not controversially, that democracy is a process. It's not a thing. There's no stasis to it. So the moment where you think you've achieved it is where things go awry, because then there's no the constant vetting, deliberation, the replenishing, the revising, that stops. And, for me, it becomes an indication, and I want to be careful how I say it, but I'll say it. But I think there are so few democracies that exist because the instincts and incentives in the other direction often seem so much, they seem easier in some ways, which makes, I think, maintaining, and that's the key word, maintaining a democracy constant and very arduous work.
Yeah, I think that the entire process of democracy requires so much vigilance. It requires so much attention to what's going on. And that can be really tricky, particularly in a time when we're focused on other things. So the pandemic has raised all kinds of questions about the economy, about our healthcare, but we have to keep our eye on the ball and think about how we're going to be able to get to the polls in November and whether we'll be counted in the census and how the Supreme Court will have power or less power over us going forward. I think democracy is something that we have to constantly keep in the back of our minds while we're living our daily lives, and that takes a lot of work.
Do you all think that there is, or I'll ask this of John, I guess, do you see things that are making it easier, to go with what Clarence said, making it easier to not be democratic? What are the incentives to be non-democratic that you see in the world around us today?
Let me answer that with a small anecdote. When I was a graduate student, I was trying to figure out who was writing about deliberation and democracy and how groups make decisions. And I wrote to Jane Mansbridge, who went on to become president of the American Political Science Association, fantastic democratic theorist and wonderful person. And she wrote me this long letter about democratic values and and ended with something that felt cryptic to me. She said, of course, at the end of the day, democratic governments have to produce good public policy. They have to make good decisions. They have to give us the government we want. And I thought, okay, I don't get it. I thought democracy was a bunch of institutions and principles and so on. Well, COVID-19 makes people around the world look at the United States and say, oh, is that what democracy gives you in the midst of a pandemic? Yeah, let's see how Singapore is doing. Fortunately, there's New Zealand and many other countries that are as much democracies as us, or much more so, who are handling it quite well. But every time a democracy fails to rise to a serious policy challenge, and a more authoritarian country seems to have it under control, sometimes because of information management, it's a bad deal for democracy, and its stock value falls. So that's, I think, one of the reasons why it's easier to think, well, democracy, all this freedom, it makes it impossible for people to make smart collective decisions. I'd rather be in a country where the government has more control over our lives.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add to that. I mean, I think that this is the problem. But crises create, or can and often create, a sense of uncertainty and anxiety, and that can or perceived crisis. If we think, for example, about demographic change, and so that can create a climate where someone says, "Listen, you're feeling insecure. I have the answer. It's this group, or it's this particular process, or there's some policy that needs to be repealed or invoked, or reinstituted, and I'll put you at ease. You trust me, and things will be right." And I think we see time and time again how seductive that can be in any number of ways. And I think we're seeing it. I mean, obviously, we're seeing it. We're seeing that right now, and I think it speaks to how I think democracies are always, I would say, fragile. That I don't think that there's anything unique about the situation that we're in. Quite the contrary. I think we've had many decades of American exceptionalism, where people want to believe that the United States is somehow different. Our trajectory is different, and in fact, we are susceptible to the same impulses and instincts toward fascism as any other nation that's existed that calls itself democratic. Though at the same time, and this is what keeps me getting up in the morning, I think we're also seeing, outside of, if you will, the institutional electoral political process, we see impulses toward what I would call, some would call radical democracy, others would call social democracy, that's happening outside of the regular processes. And I think it's important to keep in mind, obviously, that democracies are able to maintain themselves, ironically, because of the pressures that come from without routinized politics. As much as those routine politics are important to maintaining social movements, those kinds of things that happen in the streets are also a really important corrective to some of the things that ail societies that call themselves democratic.
I think that's true historically, and I think that's part of my optimism, is thinking about the history here, although it's hard to have optimism, and that is that we've been in some much more difficult moments where it's even harder to vote. You think about the fact that we held an election during the Civil War. In the middle of the Civil War, we held an election, and that's really the first time we engaged in wide-scale voting by mail. And so that's a moment that we can look to say, hey, this is a tough time, this is a difficult moment, and we're facing a lot of challenges ahead, but that doesn't mean that we need to look to a dictator-style person to lead us. In fact, we have gone through these kinds of things before, and we have the tools to move forward if we can just fight for them and keep an eye on them and pay attention.
One of the great things about American democracy is how many democracies it is. That is, we have very robust local and state government, and so many states. And so going back to Rachel's example, we often talk about the lowest common denominator. Well, that's what democracy will all boil down to. But actually, you can think of it exactly the other way around. We have states that run mail-in elections quite competently. And on almost any public policy problem, you can find a government within the United States, again, a state or local government, that is quite capably handling that problem, including the coronavirus. There have been some very mature, very scientifically informed judgments about it. And so when we judge our country, it's so tempting, as I did a minute ago, to focus on the federal government and roll your eyes and say, wow, we're lost. But then Rachel reminds you, well, there's lots of governments, and some of those really know what they're doing. And that should inspire us, because in the United States, sometimes we do wind up adopting a policy state by state and then ultimately federally that was based on one of the democracies in this country that got it right.
I knew this was going to happen. This always happens. I forget to unmute myself, but I was kind of excited by what John said. I mean, I do feel like that we are at a moment, and in some ways, my tendencies. I think I'm a New Dealer who was born decades after that. But and the New Deal had problems. I mean, we can talk about the inequalities and that. But I do think that there is an importance and a need for national government to settle, intervene in national large-scale problems. And I think one of the things that I find so frightening is that it's not just simply that as a society we've not been adept, for example, at dealing with the COVID crisis. It's not just simply because there's not the political will. But I actually think that over time, if we think about the rollback of almost a century of social policy, I think we've lost the skill sets to even do it. Mm-hmm. So the idea that you can pick up and lift and do major national, federal level kinds of policy, I think that muscle has atrophied. Mm-hmm. And so it's not just that we don't have the will to do it, but I don't know that we know how. And so the calamity is both one of will and capacity. And that frightens me. And I do take the point that, I mean, if we think about any kind of policy regime, the states have always been important to that. But you have to have at some point a functional federal state, I think, to make that realizable at the scale that I think is necessary here. So Illinois can't do COVID mitigation well, and they're not. This is not a situation where a state figures it out and then that is done. This is something that we have to figure out as a national society, or we don't figure out at all. And maybe I'm making a problem bigger than it is, but I am wistful for this idea of, even if we do it badly, the idea of an interventionist. I'm going to be called all kinds of communists or whatever, but an interventionist federal state I think is really important to the maintenance of any sense of modernity and certainly a society that calls itself democratic.
Yeah, I'm gonna just echo Clarence's pessimism there, and my greatest source of pessimism is that we have started to look to the Supreme Court to fix all of our problems. So Congress doesn't act, we look to the court. The president does something we don't like, we look to the court. The court is the least democratic part of our federal government, and yet we rely on the courts for so much. And they have accumulated an enormous amount of power, enormous, to determine what is happening in this country, and especially in relationship to democracy. So a lot of people probably didn't pay attention to the various decisions of the Supreme Court over the summer in relationship to absentee voting, but they have made it 10 times harder to vote absentee by striking down provisions that would allow for longer times to get their ballots in. And also in Florida, basically making it impossible for the felons who were allowed to vote in a constitutional provision in 2018 that was voted in by an enormous majority, that they've said, now you have to pay all your fines in order to do that in Florida. And it's almost impossible to know what fines you need to pay. And so those folks are going to be disfranchised. I think that the courts have done a real disservice to the process of democracy. And again, they are the least democratic part of our federal government. And if we're going to pay attention to what's going on there, then we're going to have a much better sense of how much in danger we are if the rest of our federal government doesn't get its act together.
These are to stop with the pessimism for a second. One of the things you all mentioned is that you're drawing some hope from either social movements or from local governments. What do we need to do more of to cultivate the disposition necessary to be effective at democracy?
I think that we need to do a lot better job of educating people about what voting means and what's involved in voting. Every year when I teach classes on the Civil War era or on just the US History Survey, I try to introduce students to what the process of voting actually looks like. So what does a ballot look like? Many of them have never seen it before, and they're surprised because they have never seen that they have to vote for all of these different offices. They don't know who their local representatives are. They don't know how their state government works. And this is something that the founders were really interested in, making sure that we had an educated citizenry. And we've lost that. We've lost the ability to understand how we can participate in government, how we can understand what's going on in our government. I think we need to do a much better job of that. And starting with the education is the most important.
I'm actually, I impersonate a pessimist, but I'm actually an optimist by nature. I know I sound pessimistic, but it's because I think you have to, my view, you have to have, I think, a hard-nosed assessment, analysis of the situation, and then you think about how to address it. So the thing that does make me hopeful, I think that the kind of conversations that are happening about government, if I think about the last 20 years, going back to the presidential election in 2000 and the shenanigans that occurred there, I do feel that people have become relatively sharper in talking about issues of public policy. If we think about the kinds of conversations that are trending now about how do we fund the police, if we think about those kinds of questions. I remember I was in a store when the pandemic was starting to be felt in this local community, and there was someone who was on the phone like me who was throwing things in a basket. And he was saying to someone, I don't know who he was speaking to, he was saying, this is the problem with capitalism, that, it creates these kinds of incentives to do exactly the thing that I'm doing. And so it was hilarious, but it was also really sharp political analysis at the same time. So in some ways, there's a civics class, right, that's unfolding in front of us. The traction that we've had, that's a different question. But I think that there are ways in which political education, as a result of all of the calamities, is occurring. People are thinking and talking about what are alternative ways of organizing a society. How can we look differently? That certainly encompass issues of the vote, but I also want to say is much bigger than that as well. That's beyond simply electoral politics, which indeed is one form of politics, but it's not politics in and of itself. So I think that gives us a really good shot. The question is, how do you organize and mobilize that and give direction to it? I think in some ways it's the political question right now. And I think we see that continuing to be worked out in real time. Yeah.
That's a great segue into my contribution here, which is, you remember in the video, I talked briefly about something called the Oregon Citizens Initiative Review, right, where a random sample of voters get together and analyze a policy issue and say something pretty intelligent about it. Well, the same folks who run that this year are doing something different. During the pandemic, they decided to do an online citizens assembly in the state of Oregon. So they've got together 40 randomly selected people from all over the state, and they're meeting virtually every week. This week is the 7th and last session. And they're working with the state legislature to advise the legislature, and the issues they chose were housing and education. And in the last meeting, we were, as a team of researchers, reflecting on the session, and one of us said, what's really exciting to me is that I'm seeing in the group discussions, people are starting to think about things at a systemic level. They're starting to see, okay, how we treat the renter relates to the experience of the landlord, which relates to the experience of the homeowner, which relates to the experience of being homeless. These are all housing. And so we can't just address one of those constituencies. And it was, a very sophisticated comment, and I'm optimistic that they will have some useful things to say to the legislature. It's a pilot program, but it's a great example of something I say all the time, which is what you think about the capacity of the average American for reason and empathy. It depends entirely upon where you see them. If you see them on Fox News, if you hear them on talk radio, you'll reach one conclusion. But if you actually sit down with them in a structured way where everyone has reason to believe that they'll be listened to and that they should listen to others, they're quite good at it. And they actually care what other people think, and they're curious and interested in different points of view. So that leaves me optimistic that properly structured, the American public is still quite capable of talking through controversial issues, weighing values trade-offs on issues. It's just right now we have a system that doesn't foreground the incentives for that kind of talk.
So why do you think that we don't hear stories like this? It would require having a scholar who's connected to those people to know that this is going on. Why do you think other states haven't adopted what Oregon is doing, or haven't tried these democratic experiments?
Well, some really great ideas in democracy have historically taken quite a bit of time to take shape and get adopted. I'm not saying this will become one of them. Something like participatory budgeting has spread much faster across the world. And so there's historical reasons why some things will move quickly into implementation and other things are resisted. The examples I'm giving, this idea of randomly selecting people and putting them in positions where they can actually influence one another or potentially elected officials, that is an old idea that disappeared for centuries until the jury came along. And even then, the jury just existed by itself. And now we're seeing this idea of random selection popping up all over the world. So, who's to say how far it will go? But I'm optimistic that it is taking hold. It will just take, honestly, a few decades. As somebody who looks at media a lot, I think most of the way that we consume democracy is through the spectacle of partisan politics, right? So do you think that this does the opposite of cultivating a democratic disposition among people who experience politics in this way?
I'll say something about that. I think I might go in a slightly different direction than maybe you're wanting to go with the question. But as John was talking, I was thinking that some of this is about, what is the health and even the existence of local and regional newspapers, if we think about that. So this becomes a capacity question. So there's some folks who can't even tell you about policies that are being made about their roads, let alone other kinds of advocacy that might be happening in their communities. Because the paper, if it does exist, you have two people who have to cover sports and, in the city council or what have you, and there are a lot of decisions that get made that don't occur. There's a lot of activity that's happening at the local level. In this community, we have people who are mobilizing, who are faculty and members of the community, who are mobilizing to help assist and provide mutual aid to people for their needs. I have to expect that there are other engagements that are occurring that are growing out of that, where people are deliberating about, well, what does it mean that we have to provide these things through our own efforts, and that the state, all right, quote unquote, doesn't have the capacity to do that. But where will those live? Now, we can talk about social media, right? And so there's a lot of information, but that's very different than knowledge, and that can become its own a bit echo chamber. So I always come back to the issue, if we're talking about media, is the capacity that exists at the lower level. If we think about, the consolidation that's occurred, which really everything from news to even the radio stations, you can drive from here to the other side of the country and it'll be the same 10 songs, whatever genre of music you listen to, right? These things are all, I think, part and parcel to how you maintain a democracy, with the kind of deep digging and diversity of viewpoints and perspective taking that can occur, but that do not in a context where those opportunities are diminished.
I think that we have to be a little bit less critical of partisanship. It's existed for so long in our country that it seems like it's a new invention, but it really isn't. In the Civil War period, it was incredibly intense and difficult, and people managed to come out and vote and to participate in democracy. Now, some people in the United States were prevented from participating, but not because of partisanship. So I do think we need to be a little bit more careful about how we talk about partisanship, because we just assume that it is a negative thing in society. But I think that is really connected to information and to media and the ability to get real information and to get the truth, which is very challenging, as Clarence said, when you don't have local newspapers, and also when you don't have the post office, which has been under threat for the last few months. The post office, which is designed to distribute information. That is its entire purpose, to educate the citizenry. And it's not a commercial organization. It's not meant to be a commercial organization. So I think information is critical. And if we have information and if we fight for that information, then partisanship only creates a more engaged democracy.
Well, Rachel, I agree that partisanship is a natural part of a good democracy. I think it's good to have parties that organize ideas and different points of view. And Matt, I do think we need a communication infrastructure that puts those ideas in front of us if they help us make choices. Right. The problem I see with partisanship as it's manifested right now in the United States is that the two political parties are not giving us forthright choices. That is, people aren't entirely sure what they're getting from one party or the other. And honestly, the communications professionals that work from those parties aren't necessarily interested in making those choices clear to us. They have other things to sell, children and the future and all sorts of messaging, fear and so on. So sometimes I do look at some multi-party democracies, some of which are wildly dysfunctional, but others of which say, you know what, there's actually a range of different legitimate points of view, and there are a range of parties to choose from. You should really think about what you value and what kind of a world you want to live in, because there's a party that will articulate that vision. And in the parliament, we'll then have those conflicting visions, and we'll have to form coalitions. And that's all about making choices. Mm-hmm. It just doesn't feel that way at the federal level, at least in the United States, that the political parties and the media infrastructure we have, broken as it is, are really helping people make sharp and clear choices.
Yeah.
I think that's so true in terms of how it has an impact on the local and state level as well, because partisan organizations are so connected to those state and local offices now in ways that they didn't used to be in the 19th century. And you could have multiple different parties in each state, and you could have more parties on the federal level. But now the organizations are so streamlined top to bottom that it is really hard to make that choice. And I think that one of the real reasons for that is actually the standardization of the ballot, the ways in which you have to get on the ballot, and the parties are the way you do that. And that was not necessarily the case previously, before the standardization of the ballot at the end of the 19th century. And so that's had actually a really big impact on our ability to create more parties and to have splintering of the current parties. And I think that would actually change things, but we're not going to abandon the standardized ballot, I think.
Yeah. I wanted to touch on something that we covered in the video, which is the case of Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico, which we wanted to put in there to remind people that there are a whole lot of citizens who don't get represented in our system. What do you all feel about the importance of bringing those people into the fold and giving them full franchise?
Well, I think it's critically important. I think one big problem in our democracy is that we often assume that things are now what they've always been. And it's just not the case. We have changed the way that we do almost everything institutionally. And we have not just had 50 states forever, as you know immediately if you start thinking about it. We have to give people who are citizens of the United States the right to vote. They do not deserve to be disfranchised just because they live in different parts of, they don't live in the 50 states that we assume to be the states of the United States. So I think we need to be a little bit more willing to change the way that we think about what our democracy looks like.
what's so alarming to me about the present day is that our president, not long before this was recorded, said flatly, I don't want to see widespread mail-in voting because it will create more votes for Democrats than Republicans. It was a moment of candor, just dispensing with the fable about voter fraud and just saying, yeah, no, that will cost my party votes. And when we talk about DC statehood, when we talk about Puerto Rico, when we talk about felons getting their voting rights back, as Rachel alluded to earlier, there's one political party that is lined up consistently on those as saying, yeah, no, I don't want those things because that'll help the other party. That's not what partisanship is for. That is a manifestation of, frankly, political corruption, because one political party is saying that, no, we don't actually value democratic principles. We value a political power. And both parties are vying for political power, but the deal is supposed to be that they vie for political power within the rules and principles of a democratic process. Even if they start losing ground, you don't change the rules. You have to change your message. You have to change what policies you stand for. But that's what's so alarming right now, is it's just become so brazen how in the case of issue after issue, when it comes to voter enfranchisement, quite frankly, one political party is on the wrong side.
I think this speaks to, if we think historically, and if Puerto Rico certainly in DC contemporarily, but if we think about kind of the dirty work that race has done historically and continues to do in these issues, around these issues. And so if you can find ways to other and render disposable the individuals who are perceived to be beneficiaries of public policy or who might have an undue advantage perceived in the electoral arena, then a lot of people will line up in support of what you're advocating for. An example of this, to make it less abstract, if we think about the fact that if you say the word welfare, right, that conjures very particular kinds of gender and racial imagery, even though welfare is anything, the post office included, anything that a society does to add value, benefit, take care of the needs of the citizenry. And so this notion of how, if you will, a retreat of the social welfare aspects of government, right, that's been tied to racial vilification, racial denigration. And I think that this is in part how, if you can, I'll put it this way, if you can convince people that building a bridge or funding education is going to benefit someone who is other than you, however that's construed, then people will refuse to do it, even if they're at risk of falling into the river if they drive over that bridge that's not been repaired in decades. And I think that's one of the dangerous moments that we have, that I think there are particular conversations that we could have about social policy. But there's such I think a seduction of, what your problem is? It's this person over here who's unlike you. And if we just contain that person, then everything else will be fine. And here are the policies that, well, they actually don't necessarily benefit you, but you'll get 3 cents and that person will get 1, or they'll have nightmares and no money at all. And a lot of people will sign up for that, unfortunately, and there's a long history of that. Certainly, this is the work that Rachel is doing, right, in her role at the Richard Center, but also speaks to the work that John has done, certainly mine as well. If we think about changes in social policy over the course of the latter 20th century and where that's left us right now.
One of the things over the summer that's given me hope for democracy has actually been the social protest movements that have emerged since the spring, which seem chaotic in some ways, especially on television, because television likes to show things burning. But to me, they have showed a level of engagement that gives me hope for people's engagement with the principles surrounding democracy. For instance, the idea that the Black Lives Matter movement has been tied to questions of justice, to me seems like a really important framing of it as a part of this democratic process.
But for me, if I may, this goes back to the earlier point that I mean, I think it's easier to just bring down the fist. I mean, as I like to say, democracy is funky, right? I mean, democracy is you come in and you say, I'd like to do this, and folks say, no, I don't think that that's the right thing to do. We ought to do this, and so there you have it. But I think um, but if there's hope for us, I think that as you described it, chaotic, kind of activities, those are going to be really important. I think to whether we're going to have a society that we will call democratic. I'm not convinced that we have a democracy, so that's why I kind of hedge when I talk about that. But I think if the hope is there, that's the kind of activity, as messy, as inconclusive, as open-ended as it is, as jarring as it can be. I think that's if there's going to be any hope, that's going to be a big part of it, right? The question is, how do we translate that into some concrete, as many people already have done, kinds of demands, and people's ability to sustain those demands over the longer term, I think is going to be very critical at this point. But for that reason, I'm hopeful, because I think that as long as there's a fight, if nothing else, you get to determine what the terms of surrender will be, if it comes to that.
Have Rachel or John, have you seen the protests over the last 3-4 months as being a sign of democratic vibrancy or of a last gasp?
Definitely not a last gasp. It's certainly part of vibrancy. I have pessimism about whether we will have the staying power to think about these things once the pandemic ends. I think one of the silver linings of the pandemic, which is a weird thing to say, is that people were really focused on the news, constantly on the news. And I think there are a lot of distractions usually. Turn on a baseball game or a basketball game instead of looking to see what's going on in the country. And the minute we sort of get back to our regular lives, I think it's going to be really hard to maintain that kind of engagement and awareness. I'm excited by seeing people get involved and get into the fight, but I'm not sure that I have the optimism that it will continue.
Okay.
Yeah, I think protests can serve a whole bunch of different purposes. The Tea Party protests, there's a pretty straight line to the fractures that have occurred within the Republican Party and the ascent of Trump, right? And I understand that was, partly from the grassroots and partly from the top down, but it did become a populist movement that gave rise to a populist president. The Occupy Wall Street protest was notorious for not having a clear policy objective, but I think you can draw a pretty straight line to Bernie Sanders and to pressure on the Democratic Party for a more progressive policy agenda, and whatever the consequences of that have been. The Black Lives Matter protests, to me, are different in a way from both of those, in that I was frankly surprised to see how far public opinion had moved prior to the incidents that gave rise to these protests in terms of public opinion towards police brutality and the treatment of African Americans by police. The numbers are quite striking in terms of how strong public opinion is on that issue, where it's moved as much as 20 points in the last 10 years. That's pretty dramatic to now being a quite large majority that is concerned about that issue. So the protests, I think, have a more solid base of public concern to stand on. Whether they'll deliver policy results is a question that remains to be answered. And given the nature of American politics, these things can be confusing. One of the most important criminal justice reforms just occurred during the Trump administration for all kinds of interesting bipartisan reasons. So whether we can build on that and go even farther in the next administration may depend partly on the efficacy of those protests, but I think it will really hinge on this more gradual and less noticed shift in public opinion on that issue. Just to give you one more example, after the end of the Cold War, the Clinton administration shut down a ton of military bases, something that was kind of unthinkable during the Cold War. And when you looked behind the scenes, you could see that there was actually quite a shift in public opinion that was eminently reasonable, which is, I think the Cold War is over, right? We probably don't need as much, in terms of military bases. And then Congress actually created a great process for choosing which bases to close. The Base Closure Commission was a reasonably deliberative process. So I hope that the Black Lives Matter protests have maybe galvanized the pre-existing public opinion. They may result in electoral outcomes that make possible some more systemic policy reform, and as Clarence points out, not kind of a piecemeal Chicago here, San Francisco there kind of reform, but really a national reform that in the same way that the drug laws created a tremendous tragedy and prison overcrowding and so on, perhaps we'll move our nation in the right direction on those kinds of issues, again, with the protests playing a role in that movement.
Can I build on that?
Sure.
Just very quickly. I mean, I think that the thing that we have to keep in mind, and it's difficult to do that, I always caution about measuring outcomes based on the electoral field. I'm going to be that person. As much as that field matters, I mean, I think that there are other measurements in this sense, which may or may not be helpful. So if we think about the Black Lives Matter activism that's occurring now, and we scroll backwards, we'll see that some of those individuals who are participating were individuals who were involved in Occupy Wall Street activity at the local level, as well as individuals who had been, for instance, in a number of cities and organizing campaigns around fast food and other service workers. So there is a cumulative thing that occurs. The outcomes of that, I mean, the jury is still out, but I think one parallel maybe fits, maybe doesn't. If we think about trade unionism in the early 20th century, talk about what I know. After the First World War, most of those campaigns were unsuccessful. They went down in pretty hard defeat. But those individuals didn't fall off the face of the earth, right? They turned up again in the 30s and in the 1940s, which became a really important moment in the labor movement in the United States. So the narrative is not over in terms of where where this might be heading. And I think that many historians, when they look back on this, will think about Ferguson in this moment as not episodic and separate, but as something of a continuous moment. And we don't yet know what the trajectory is of that. But certainly if we compare this moment to what happened, about 5 years ago, I've been impressed, surprised really, at how long people stayed mobilized, maybe not organized, but certainly mobilized. And I don't think that story is over. Now, whether those results will be readily identifiable in terms of electoral outcomes, it depends on how significant you think that outcome is. I want to be open-ended to a number of different trajectories here, my own self. And in fact, I think we do have to ask the question of how is it, and Rachel, you would know this more than I would in terms of numbers, but one thing that strikes me about our electoral system are the number of people who just opt not to participate in that. And I don't believe that that's necessarily a commentary on them for not participating. So I think we have to complicate this notion of how we work backwards from what has results in the electoral arena, as significant as that arena is.
Yeah, I'm interested in, maybe I'll just think out loud and you can tell me if, that the reason this has intrigued me is that this framing of this is about being a question of structural justice. I teach film, and some of my favorite democratic filmmakers are populist in a sense. So Frank Capra's movies are always surrounding the bad guy who is an elite, who's disconnected from the everyday, the people who like piggyback rides and, mom's strawberry preserves. And I'm wondering if the reason that the framing of the Black Lives Matter as a question of justice has resonated so much is that the villain in this case are police who don't follow the same rules that the rest of us follow, right? That there's something unequal about the people who are beating people in the street that strikes at the heart of our democratic sensibilities. I wonder if you all think that might be a reason why so many diverse groups of people are polling so well or are part of that public opinion, John, that you mentioned.
Well, it's fashionable to say that the American people don't really care about democracy. They care about their personal liberty, their economic livelihood, and so on. Democracy is too abstract, and so on. But I think this is an example of that, Matt. And in all kinds of mundane ways, people are actually pretty passionate about the idea of democracy. In the case you're describing, it is a question of basic fairness and the freedom to live your life without any expectation that a government is going to suddenly commit violence toward you. I think the challenge the protests have had in reaching an even wider audience comes down to whether you're attacking a behavior, an institutional problem that creates that behavior, or the entire institution. And it's so easy to move to the entire institution. Police are bad. Defund the police, right? That rhetoric may have had some interesting origins, but it attached itself pretty quickly. And so there's pushback from people who say, I understand, I don't want injustice. I want people to be treated fairly. These are horrendous cases, but don't attack the police, right? So it's tricky. If you appeal to that sense of injustice and that basic principle of fairness, you have on board a huge supermajority, but you risk the issue just falling off the radar because it became partisan, and as a result, there was deadlock. If the issue drifts into, no, police are bad, and that's not a question of justice at that point. It's a question of whether or not a particular institution that is connected to lots of people's lives in very meaningful ways is a good or a bad institution. When it's about fairness, when it's about justice, when it's about basic human dignity, the movement's very successful because those are meaningful concepts to the average person in the United States, or frankly in most countries that we would reasonably say are something like a democracy.
I'm not as confident as John in the democratic spirit of America. I mean, there are a lot of layers, I think, to answering that question that you've posed. I mean, I think in some ways we're seeing another cumulative moment. So if we think about the discourses about police misconduct and abuse, particularly in communities of color, that's been an ongoing conversation. As someone who's been politically active, I can remember that there was a period of time where people denied the fact that there was anything such as racial profiling. That was a battle for that to be documented and to be accepted, and that occurred over some time. I think that this is where social media, which I have a lot of problems with, I think has been a really important assist here, because what you then have is the material to confront people with some clear images and force people to take moral and ethical decisions. And so I think that that's been really important, how this is trended. And my response is messy, but I'll end by saying this. And again, I'm an optimist, but I'll say this. I think it remains to be seen how long this would be a matter that the masses of the white public will embrace. As I review my history, I can't identify a time where anti-racism has been a mass sentiment among the vast majority of white Americans. And so when people begin to frame the conversation about how everyone has come around this issue, I get naturally skeptical. And I do think that if you start to talk about policy implications about how we address it, and the policies are not just simply that we punish those individual officers who are involved in incidents, but we talk about how we fund, how we oversee our police departments. I think that you would start to see a lot more fissures, and those fissures would not just fall along partisan party lines, but I think people would be forced to make different kinds of decisions that have been made. So if you ask people, do you oppose people being choked out, beaten on camera? Yeah, I think most people will say yes to that. But when you start to ask these systemic questions, well, what does this mean about the role that police ought to have in our societies? Should police have firearms? Try that question out.
Yep. Yep.
And see where that begins to go, even though we know there's some societies where police carrying firearms, that looks very different than it does in the United States, then it becomes more complicated. And I think that people will start to leave the party, not political party, but, figuratively speaking,
Right.
the party around this. Of course, happy to be wrong about all of this, but I think this is more difficult than we make it,
Okay.
frankly.
I'm going to ask one kind of final question here to help us wrap up, which is about, we're all educators, right? We're interested in we're at a land-grant university. We're interested in cultivating citizenship and educating as citizens. So what type of thing that we don't do right now would you like to see at Penn State to help cultivate this democratic sensibility or democratic disposition that we can kind of charge our students to go forward into the world with? What pedagogical or classes or what things would you like to see?
Well, I would say that the Department of African American Studies released a letter in which they outlined several things that they thought the administration ought to do, including having more classes that teach people about anti-racism and the history of racism, and also about these kinds of oppressions within democracies. And I think that is essential. And if I were to ask one thing, it would be for the administration to consider very seriously that letter and try to address all of the things that they demanded.
I would like to see a more coherent and comprehensive university-wide policy on voter registration. Believe it or not, some students who have worked for voter registration on campus have actually run into all kinds of problems on campus, some resistance. And it's perfectly understandable that Penn State doesn't want to get in the business of choosing a political party, taking a partisan position. But that doesn't mean that it should be in the business of helping the students find their political voice and use it. So not only getting students to make sure they're registered, whether in the municipality where the campus is or in the home they might come from, it's also about encouraging them to then use that opportunity to express their political voice. So I think Penn State is not unique in this regard. Universities could do all kinds of things to make that a part of the purpose of a public university, kind of a civic education that gets beyond any particular classroom.
So let me thank you for the invitation to be part of this conversation. I really appreciate it, having the opportunity to think out loud with others and talk about things beyond budgets and COVID. But what I'll say, I agree with everything that's been said. And I'll speak maybe from the standpoint of an administrator as I think about just how the university functions. And I think that these issues of inequality, of equity, they occur in very routine and mundane kinds of ways. So it's not people being called by slurs or what have you, that occurs. But it's far more insidious in the fact that it's just kind of the normal kinds of processes. And so the thing that I would be interested in, and I think that's how a number of forms of inequality function in very mundane kinds of ways, and which is why people consent to them. And so I'm interested in thinking about policies and practices where we audit ourselves about the kind of daily routine cultures that are racist, that are sexist. Let's go down the board, that are perpetrated routinely by individuals who would not ever think of themselves as such, and have the luxury of not having to think about the impact of their actions or the impact of their inactions, but simply about what they intend to do. And I think that I think there needs to be some soul searching about how we do the mundane daily work of creating a more equitable, inclusive, and I dare say just university community. And I don't have a magic bullet. I mean, I'm as much part of this process as anyone else, but I think those are the kinds of questions that we need to be asking ourselves and others as we engage the broader issues in the world.
Okay. Well, I would like to thank you all three once again for taking part in this conversation, and for taking part in the video that we watched before this. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Pleasure.
you.
I would like to introduce our second panel, all students here at Penn State University who are committed to the process of democracy. Blake Tolliver is a Schreier's Honors College student majoring in English and also represents the Black Caucus on the University Park Student Government. Fernando Munoz is a member of the Latino Caucus and Paul Robeson Cultural Center Student Liaison Director at Penn State. Aidan Nye is a fellow at the McCourtney Institute for Democracy, where he works on the Mood of the Nation poll. So I asked all of you to take part in this conversation, which is hoping to kind of expand on some things that we touched on earlier, because you're all involved in the democratic process of student government in some way. And one of the things that we're really proud of as a land-grant university is the way that we are kind of creating or cultivating future citizens, people who will be engaged in the process. So could I ask, I'll start with you, Blake, what got you involved in campus politics?
What really got me involved with campus politics was a call to action that I felt that was very necessary. I know the Black Caucus rep position was created last year, and I saw that definitely as an opportunity to make a change within the Black community in which I'm a part of. And I know how long that fight has been. Like, there's so many people that I've talked to in the past that were Penn State alum who were there sitting in doing silent protests at General Assembly meetings in order to get this spot created. And I felt like something that powerful I would love to be a part of. And so I took the initiative on my own to run. Black Caucus had voted me in. And from there, I just started to gauge more of kind of what the community likes, because I held racial justice roundtables this summer. Given everything that's been going on, I just made sure I wanted to start the year on a note of me being as informed as possible, given that we're going to be going to a very difficult time period. And I just wanted to know that as I go into that time period, I'm the most informed representative for the community in which I'm representing. And from there on out, I'll use that information, continue to gather that knowledge, and from there represent my community.
Fernando, what would you say?
Being a Hispanic man from California was a complete opposite of Pennsylvania life. You know, there's a lack of, diversity in a predominantly, white institution, a predominantly white county, and a predominantly white state. And, it's the little things that, make people want to take action in order to get the big things done, not having able to, speak my native language, not be able to eat my good food, and just to bring awareness to that and kind of empower my community as well as other communities that may not be able to empower themselves at Penn State.
And Aidan?
Yeah, so with my work at with the McCourtney Institute, I work on, as said, the Mood of the Nation poll. So I'm kind of getting a national finger on the pulse of what general Americans are thinking. I found that when I came into college at Penn State, it was kind of easy to keep check on what the situation was like in my hometown and even at the Penn State community. But I realized, especially after 2016, that my perspective is so limited. And so with the McCourtney Institute, I was really interested in the ability that I have to gain a broader sense for what America thinks, more generally speaking. And it's helped to certainly broaden my horizon and allow me to formulate actions that I may want to take on campus and just in my general community that I might not have been so aware of if I hadn't had this opportunity.
Okay. And what have all of you learned about democracy from these various activities that you've been involved in?
I would say for me specifically, it's all in access. If you don't have access to democracy, how are you supposed to participate in it? Mm-hmm. Like when UPA reps get elected, there's an election process. And most students who are students of underrepresented communities on campus might not know about these elections, because UPA for the longest time has somewhat been an exclusive club, And if you don't know anything about that exclusive club or when those elections are held to get into that exclusive club, you'll never be part of it, which should never be part of democracy. So that's been a way I've seen that how democracy. I totally lost your question, but it was somewhere around there. I'm sorry.
Okay. Fernando, what have you learned?
That democracy in the United States is not what it appears to be. The textbooks that everyone has a voice. A lot of it is disenfranchisement. A lot of it's based on income. A lot of it's based on race. So it's important to tackle those issues directly, fiercely, and by any means necessary.
And what would you guys say? What's the difference between your experience of democracy on campus and your experience of democracy at home?
I think. Oh, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, Fernando.
Go ahead. No, the floor is yours, man.
Thank you. So I grew up in Butler, Pennsylvania, which is an extremely rural conservative town, and it's almost entirely white. Everyone there pretty much looks like me. And coming to Penn State, while it is still an extremely white institution, I was exposed to at least slightly more broadened horizon of viewpoints, and it's definitely made me aware of issues that I don't think that I would have, even if I had read about, if I'd stayed in Butler where I grew up, I don't think I would have had the same sense for how those issues look in practice. Now that I'm having the opportunity as I move forward to interact with more people who aren't like me, who have not had my experiences, I'm made aware of just how salient these issues are, and they're not just words on a page and issues that you can see in the news and then kind of scrape off like they don't affect you. And that I've been so fortunate to come to the realization that these things really do matter, and that every little outcome of the democratic process has a real effect on people.
Okay. Fernando, how are things different here than California in terms of democracy?
Demographics are very different, but it boils down to who has the power and who has the wealth, and a lot of people who want to be a part of the democratic process have to worry about feeding their kids, going to getting their job, trying to pay the bills. If you have the time, of course you can be part of the democratic process. If you have the wealth, of course you can, but a lot of people are just disenfranchised by socioeconomic practices. So it's the same at the end of the day. I mean, we're blessed to be at a institute of higher education, but the demographics are not what the United States is, not what Pennsylvania is, it's not what California is. So we still are struggling at any aspect. Those are the problems with democracy, unfortunately. We can always fix it.
Blake?
Yeah, most of my childhood, I moved to Clifton Heights a few years ago. However, most of my childhood, a decent amount of my childhood was spent in New Jersey in a small town called Mickleton. And during that time, it was a very small town. Again, there's nothing going on. So you're kind of just you don't see it. Democracy is not something you'll see. You don't see people walking the streets. You don't see people just come up to your house. Everybody kind of minds their own business. And I don't think I saw democracy as clear as I could have until I got to Penn State. And when I got to Penn State, I saw many people are actively involved within democracy. And I think it's a visibility issue. You need to see democracy happening to believe that it exists.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like a person like me, when a lot of people around my age, especially in my town, might not take that serious. But when you get to Penn State, it's a whole different atmosphere. You have PSU votes going on, so many elections, different groups are trying to get things together to help students cast their ballots. So that's when democracy is right in your face. And when I got to Penn State, it definitely was more in my face than ever.
Mm-hmm. And how do you find your fellow students? You three are kind of a self-selected group of people who are engaged, but do you find your fellow students engaged in the process or not?
From my perspective, I think that I don't see many of my peers involved because it comes down to a time issue. And if you don't have time to commit yourself or involve yourself in democracy, then you'll never be part of it. And I think a lot of college students get lost in, I have to focus on school, I have a job, maybe voting might be on their last thing on their to-do list. And unfortunately, that's the reality we live in. College students might not think their vote matters. However, it really does. But I think that's definitely a reason why students don't engage, because they just don't have time to. I know that you should have the time to. However, unfortunately for college students, when you're paying back your student loans, voting might not be the most thing that's on your to-do list and is the priority at the moment.
Aiden?
I definitely agree with that. I think timing is, whether it's appropriate or not, always an excuse for students, because a lot of the times, exactly, when you're funding your education, you want to make sure that you're getting the most of your dollar and making sure that your time at university isn't wasted. I'm very fortunate to be in some groups at school where I have people that are very passionate about the democratic process, but I think it's easy for me then to put myself in a kind of an echo chamber and think, okay, well, if my friends are caring about this, then everyone is. But then I remember how large Penn State is, and I find myself even sinking into complacency sometimes. So I think one of the things that I've had to remember is that if I have a great day where I'm like, I voted, I spoke with some friends about a political issue, that's not necessarily representative of every day. And I think that the majority of time by most students at Penn State is, like Blake said, largely focused on schoolwork and just getting through the educational aspect of life at Penn State. Whereas we all could do better, especially I'm guilty of it too. We could all do better about being more involved and more engaged in that process.
Okay. Fernando, any thoughts?
Yeah, it's priorities in this country. I mean, when we talk about civic duty and responsibilities, people are always finding excuses to get out of jury duty and, have all these reasons. But I mean, that's the society we live, we can't worry about civic duty because we, at the end, like I said before, we have bigger priorities, bills, feeding your kids, keeping the lights on. And some people have the pleasure of not having to worry about things and get engaged. And some are just living life day to day, trying to figure it out. So that's something we need to fix if we want to have a more democratic and more engaged population with civic duty.
Do you think that there's something about civic duty, if we want to call it that pushes students away from participation in democracy?
I mean, a lot of kids' votes don't believe they matter. I mean, you have, the priorities are different. Being a kid, you don't worry about taxes. You don't worry about the things adults, the majority of the voting class in this country, are older people because it impacts them more. So I think we are taught at a very young age not to worry about it until it's too late and try to change as much as possible. And we only have 20, 30 years left of our lives, but we're the ones who are dealt with the most of that time. So you see a lot of changes in this country where people being more aware, social media, using the internet is providing more access to people, but it starts from a very early age and we seem to be missing that.
Mm-hmm. Blake, you have any thoughts about that?
Could you repeat the question again, please?
Is there something that is turning people off about the participating in the process? The students, you say students don't engage.
I think, even in UPUA itself, a lot of students just feel like I vote for a rep, then what happens? They just don't really know what's the next step or what really matters. I think a lot of students are in this bubble that things don't matter. It's kind of like a thing of mostly all students. It's kind of like you don't know. Sometimes you just don't really know what your voice really means on a campus of 40,000 people. Mm-hmm. And that might not make you want to engage because you feel so small. And at Penn State, you can feel very small. And it's not that hard to feel small at a large school like that. So you just feel like you don't matter. And that's unfortunate, but however, it's the reality of UPUA in general because not many people vote for the people that they're electing into UPUA. You see 20 people on the ballot and all 20 people make it. Is that democracy? If you get all your friends to vote for you and they vote you in, but that's not representative of the whole campus, that's not democracy. Okay. So I think there's definitely an issue with people not feeling their voice matters and also people taking advantage of the system and the fact that people don't feel like their voice matters to put themselves in power. And it's unfortunate. However, it's kind of like a downfall of democracy. If people don't participate in it, it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. I think also it made me think about, students not feeling they're being represented or their voices are being heard. Also, I hear so much that as a general, as America, the student voice matters. The student vote is heard. The vote of the young people is so crucial in decision making. And I think that it's a pitfall of, frankly, all young people, that the more you tell them to do something, the more they're going to want to not do it. So the more that we hear on the news, that we read on our phones, that our voice is the most influential, I think that breeds a sense of, as I said before, of complacency. If I think that I've got this locked up, if young people are so important, then of course my voice is going to be heard, and I don't need to do as much as maybe I should. And that's a privilege to feel that way, and certainly something that I think should be avoided. But I think that it's especially a reality, and certainly at places like Penn State, when you think that your voice can be counted because you're part of a body of students that you assume feels the same way you do, and then when things don't work out the way you thought they might, you're kind of left reeling and thinking, how did this happen? Why did this happen? And I think it's because we are told about how much our value matters that we start to believe and we overestimate the pull that we have.
which leads me to my next line of questioning, which is that one of the things that if you do poll young people, they're very passionate about issues and social advocacy and social meaning in particular. Did any of you take part in any of the protests and the things that went on over the spring and summer?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I know I did as well. Like I said, I'm from a very small town in rural Pennsylvania, and so after, the murder of George Floyd and countless other people of color in America, I decided to go to my hometown library and protest. And I went 2 days. The first day it was just me, which was fine, and then the second day, somehow the story of what I was doing got misconstrued, and people assumed that a large group of out-of-state rioters was coming into town. And so the second day that I was at the library with a cardboard sign and a mask on, I was very fortunate to have a group of about 10 other people come out and support. But we were greeted by about 30 to 40 armed people, most brandishing automatic weapons, which was something that was very disturbing for me, because you see that happening in Charlottesville, and you see that happening all across the country, and you think, wow, that's unreal. I can't imagine that. But then to see it in the town where, across the street, I had worked at the coffee shop in high school, and then to see somebody with, in my opinion, an assault weapon, a machine gun, a weapon of death, like, I was so frightened. And I think that's the point. And I felt that was like, message received. I felt intimidated. I felt to be made smaller. And that was certainly not something that I didn't like. Of course, no one would like that. And it's so sad that many people have to feel that way every day, especially people of color who don't look like me are made to feel that way so much more frequently. And so that was definitely a wake-up call for me this summer, and just a reminder to think about how fortunate I've been and how I can help to extend my experience to others.
Yeah. Blake, what did you take part in any protests over the summer?
Yeah, I did. I actually went to one in my hometown. It was led by 3 Black women, and it was an amazing protest, and it was a very peaceful protest. The police officers are out there with us, like they were in solidarity with us, and we were just walking, and we were chanting, and we were protesting, and it was just a community of experience that showed that it's an issue that all people of any different demographic can support and be a part of and make a change within their community. Like, it was just so nice to see the people I might not have thought to be out there, and that's great to see that. And I think that helps build community, and it helps show the solidarity of the community towards issues that matter to a lot of people and matter in terms of humanity. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that all humans can relate to, humanity. Mm-hmm. And at those protests, at the end, we did a prayer. That prayer was very, very peaceful. Like, I think at the end of that, we kneeled for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And that was just something that was like really powerful. I know other groups have done it, but I think overall just doing that with a whole community and kind of trying to figure out this thing it's so complex in terms of, like, there's so many things that have happened over my lifetime that I've yet to understand. Mm-hmm. And however, I think events like these help bring clarity and help show that the community, we together can heal from it. So I did include myself in a lot of those protests, and it definitely was a life-changing experience, especially me being a young person during this age where I don't have that big event that the whole world is in on. Like, there were events such as Trayvon Martin's killing, Michael Brown's killing. However, to get to my community, especially, this event literally affected people over in London. People in London were protesting. People in the United States are protesting. This was a global event, and I think that we had a shared experience of working towards the betterment of humanity. So I think these protests over the summer were very powerful, and I was happy to be a part of it.
Okay. Aiden, I wanted to ask you, since you're somebody who works on a public opinion poll, one of the ways that we experience democracy a lot of the times is through opinion polls, trying to gauge the mood of the nation. How do you think that relates to people's engagement with democracy? How do you think reading about how many people agree with this issue or that issue, how do you think that impacts how people participate?
Yeah, I think it has a personally, I mean, I'm biased because it's something I'm passionate about and part of the work that I do, but I think it has a huge impact. So I think the most shocking thing for me working at the Mood of the Nation poll with the McCourtney Institute is just seeing how polarized things really are right now. And they have been for quite some time. But I think, as I said earlier, you can try to follow current events and get an understanding of the situation. But when you look at the results that we put out and you see just how fractured our social political system is, I think it can give people a real desire to do more. I know that, like, personally, you know, in 2016, I didn't expect things to happen the way they did. And I thought that, you know, this is just a subset of the population and a small number of people. But moving on, and as I'm doing this polling, I get a sense for how many people feel a certain way. And it helps to motivate me, as I hope it helps to motivate others, regardless of, you know, what side of the spectrum you're on, to realize that, okay, I really could be doing more, because this problem that I thought was only a small one held by opinions of people who are small in number is really much bigger than I thought. And so it helps to, at least for me, and as I said, I hope for others, to really put things in perspective and allow people to think that they really should be stepping up and getting more involved.
Okay. Do either the other of you who don't work on polls, do you consume them? Do you read them? Does it help you gauge your thinking about democracy in America?
I think polls definitely can influence you, especially if you're on the fence about an issue. Like, seeing a poll will shift you to that other side, and polls are really powerful. Like, as a young person, if I didn't look up any of the candidates running, I don't know anything, I just see polls, and I see that maybe a certain candidate is being represented like better in that poll, and it looks better for them, and other people are agreeing with it, then most likely I might be moved that way to vote for that person. And I think polls hold a lot of weight when there's not much education about democracy, when, like, it's not in the curriculum. It's kind of something you got to learn on your own. Like, voting, they don't teach you that in elementary school.
Okay.
Like, it's something you have to go out on your own and do. However, unfortunately, social media has a huge influence on how we consume polls. And as social media, or media as an entity, is very dangerous, because it has more power than, like, the most people think, and it shapes the way we perceive the world. So those polls have a lot of power, and especially in politics, way more power than most people think.
Let me switch that, as I'm a media studies person, so I'm interested in media. What is the most influential media for your generation? What do you think what engages people the most right now in terms of either participation in politics or participation in the democratic process?
I think Twitter.
Twitter?
Yeah.
I think so. But Fernando, go ahead. You had something to say.
I think like since George Floyd, you've seen a lot of people like be a part of the democratic process with like posting. I mean, like, I have people who post like 50 things a day, like, that are like politically or like injustice related, like, you know, do this, do that, be aware of this and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, all that can matter. But, you know, a vote is a vote, you know, so it's more about, like, forget about the talk, like, where's the bite, and, you know, take that initiative, because everyone, and especially with, you know, the misinformation out there, anyone can post anything. So you got to take everything with a grain of salt.
Right.
I think for me, I don't have TikTok, but I know a lot of people my age are on TikTok, and that definitely has an influence. Like, TikTok makes its way on Instagram. It's a popular app people are using, and even people are reproducing that on Instagram, which shows the power of, like, certain things like TikTok. And videos like TikTok are so short. It's like I can get this instantaneous information in the instant, you know? Like, and a lot of people don't have that attention span, especially people our age, like, want everything when they want it and don't want to see it for long, just want to see it then.
Okay.
And I think that's a powerful tool when you're trying to get people who don't know anything about voting or don't know anything about candidates to view that information in small doses, but also still get that message across.
Okay.
Because while TikToks are short, you put 10, 12 TikToks about political things going on, eventually all the information will come together. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
So I want to relate that question here. This will be our final kind of line of questioning, which is kind of ways that we can get more people involved. As Fernando said, at the end, getting people to go from, say, consuming TikTok to voting is maybe a harder thing to do. So, having experienced a little bit of Penn State, what could we do better here to help people make that final step, to get them engaged and kind of get them up to it as being participating citizens? What can we do to foster that type of engagement more? A class, what kind of curriculum do you think you would like to see as students?
Well, aside from curriculum, and I don't mean to reroute this, but I think Penn State can make a step that I think the country should follow in making Election Day a holiday. Mm-hmm. I know one of my professors last year told students that if they went home to vote, they would get an excused absence from his class. And I have my voter registration back in my hometown. And so that's exactly what I did. I missed his class because I had gone home to vote that morning. And I think the Penn State, if they use that as a university-wide holiday, some students take classes pretty much from the time they get up to the time they go to bed, with labs and things of that, of the like. So if Penn State were to give students the opportunity to, no questions asked, you can vote, feel free to vote. However, because it's especially more difficult for some people to get to their polling places than others, which is a whole separate issue. But I think that Penn State and United States should make Election Day a holiday. That way people, with all experiences, have an easier time getting to the polls. And I think that relates back to the question I think that Fernando was talking about accessibility. That's just one more way that voting in democracy can be made more accessible. So I'd like to see that be taken a little bit more seriously by Penn State, and as well as I'm sure some other curriculum changes that Blake and Fernando are positive on.
Fernando, anything to pile on there?
Yeah, I mean, we can have the holiday, but it's like at the end of the day, like people just don't care. I mean, I know there's, you can guarantee that, people are just going to take that holiday and just go to the beach, So I think it's not the idea that like, oh, people aren't using their vote. I think people just don't believe in it. We don't teach in this country that we matter. We're always being told like, like it's never going to vote. It's never going to matter. And, we have to ingrain that in a society in order to have a functioning democracy, because otherwise it's just going to be, the unknown power that everyone has, like one vote for one person. But if people aren't using that, then they're powerless. So it's just more about empowerment and how to get that steamrolled into our head in order to create civic opportunities and have a civic society rather than just one that's complacent.
Okay.
I like to build off of that. Like, I definitely think that a lot of students have a decent amount of students at Penn State have privilege that most other students at other campuses might not have. So you don't feel like nothing really affects you. You might feel like nothing really affects you, and that might be a reason why you don't participate. However, there might be a student who's really struggling on campus, who really can't do everything that the other person who's privileged has every opportunity to do, and that they might want to vote more because they feel like their vote matters. I think a lot of students need to come down from the privilege and realize they're representing like their community, and you want the betterment for everyone. So taking it upon yourself to kind of put your privilege aside that you have and try to make a change for people who don't have that privilege. Okay. So I think that's a great way in order for people to realize that their vote matters, because while you may not think it affects you, it might affect someone you know. So I think that's a great way to try to look at it and teach students that it matters. It's not just you at the end of the day, it's everyone.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Well, I'd like to thank you all for sharing your wisdom, and I know some people. Maybe we can get some of this holiday stuff to work. So thank you for joining us for this premiere of Who Counts and for this panel discussion on democracy. If you want to recommend to friends and family to watch or listen again, you can find this in the full episode of Human Focus on the WPSU website and the Human Focus website. The conversation will also be presented as a podcast in the McCourtney Institute for Democracy's award-winning podcast series, Democracy Works. These conversations, we hope, are never about getting in the last word, because there can never be a last word on democracy. Democracy is and always will be, if we're able to keep it, about an ongoing process of deliberating about what is best for us all, given the times we find ourselves living in. Keeping this conversation going is the work of each of us we must strive for if we are going to achieve something like a more perfect union. And please remember that democracy depends on us all not only to deliberate and make our voices heard, but also to vote. So if you haven't registered to vote yet, please visit vote.org. Thank you and good night.